Welcome. Today we're going into one of the most extreme scenarios in medicine, the emergency resuscitative thoracotomy. You see it in media as this, chaotic last-ditch effort. But for you, the clinician, it has to be a cold, calculated decision. We're going to break down the hard data that governs this procedure.
Exactly. This isn't about desperation. The clinical reality is that this choice, opening a patient's chest in the emergency department, has to be driven by evidence.
So we're drawing the line based on the data.
We have to. We need to know when there's a chance, and just as importantly, when there's zero chance. The statistics tell us where that line is.
Now, okay, let's unpack that. A patient comes in, traumatic cardiac arrest. The pressure is on. What's the very first, most objective filter you can use?
It's the focused assessment with sonography for trauma, what everyone just calls the FAST exam.
The bedside ultrasound.
Right. And what you're looking for, or really not looking for, is cardiac motion. It's the fastest, most objective tool we have in that moment.
So how reliable is it if you see nothing, if there's just no cardiac motion on that screen?
It's absolute. The data shows it has a 100% negative predictive value.
100%?
Yes. That number is, well, it's stunning in medicine. If you see no cardiac motion on that ultrasound, the patient has a 0% chance of survival. The procedure will not help them.
That's an incredibly powerful piece of information to have, 100% certainty. In that high-stakes moment, what does that allow the team to do?
It allows them to stop. It lets them prevent what we call a non-therapeutic thoracotomy.
A futile procedure.
A futile procedure that consumes massive resources, time, and, it exposes the whole team to risk. Knowing there's zero chance isn't about giving up. It's about recognizing a non-survivable injury and pivoting those resources to the next patient who might have a chance.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What are the overall odds? There was a huge review, right? Something like 4,600 cases over 25 years.
That's the one. And it confirms this is a low-yield intervention. The overall survival rate was just 7.4%.
7.4. So very low. And that low number shapes a lot of perceptions. But here's the part I find fascinating. For the tiny fraction who do survive, what's their quality of life like?
This is the critical finding. Their neurological outcome is surprisingly good. We're not just talking about survival. We're talking about meaningful survival.
Okay.
The review found that 92.4% of the survivors had normal neurologic outcomes.
Wow.
Yeah. They were discharged home, able to perform activities of daily living. They got their lives back.
So 92.4% of that tiny survivor group recovered fully. That's a powerful dichotomy, isn't it? A very low chance of survival. But if you do survive, you'll probably be okay.
It is. And it tells us that the procedure for the right person is the right call. It means that when it works, it really works. It saves a life that's, worth living. It confirms the underlying injury was fixable.
Which brings us to the biggest factor of all, the mechanism of injury. How the patient got hurt in the first place. That seems to be the great divide.
It's everything. You have to draw a hard line between penetrating trauma and blunt trauma.
One is a localized problem, like a stab wound.
Right, a single repairable hole.
Yeah.
And the other, blunt trauma, say from a car crash, is it's catastrophic, widespread damage, the kind of thing opening the chest can't fix.
So let's put numbers on that. What's the survival rate for penetrating trauma?
For penetrating trauma, it's 8.8%.
Okay, 8.8. And for blunt trauma?
It plummets down to 1.4%.
1.4. That's a staggering difference.
It's a six-fold difference. And that gap basically drives trauma policy all over the world.
And even inside the penetrating trauma group, the weapon matters, right? A stab wound versus a gunshot.
Oh, absolutely. A stab wound is the most favorable scenario. The survival rate there is 16.8%.
Almost 17%. And for gunshot wounds?
It drops way down, only 4.3%.
16.8 versus 4.3.
Exactly. That specific data is what's running through a trauma surgeon's head in real time.
And this all extends to cost, too. The sources looked at cost effectiveness using quality-adjusted life years, or QALYs.
Right, and the QALY data just reinforces the physical data. For penetrating trauma, the procedure is considered very cost-effective. It's about $16,000 per quality-adjusted life year gained.
Which in healthcare is a pretty good number.
A very good number. But then you look at blunt trauma.
And what happens to the cost?
It skyrockets. For blunt trauma, it's over $163,000 per QALY.
Whoa.
It's just not considered cost-effective. It's almost 10 times more expensive for the same health benefit. For a hospital system, that data basically built a strong case against even trying for most blunt trauma arrests.
So let's build the perfect candidate then.
Yeah.
Based on all this, who has the best shot?
The ideal candidate is clear. It's a patient with penetrating trauma to the chest who arrives with signs of life.
Even flickering signs.
Yes, even if it's intermittent. Any cardiac electrical activity, pupillary reflexes, a measurable blood pressure for even a moment, that's your patient.
And for that very specific group, what can the survival rate climb to?
It can get as high as 21.3%. That's the group this procedure was designed for.
Now, time is obviously a huge factor. How long is too long for CPR before you even start?
Well, prolonged CPR is a big red flag for brain injury. The general rule is, for penetrating trauma, if CPR has been going for more than 15 minutes, you probably shouldn't proceed.
And for blunt trauma, with its already terrible odds?
The window is much smaller. You're looking at a cutoff of around 10 minutes. The time frames are they're incredibly tight.
We have to talk about kids, too. The data here is, it's especially tough. The guidelines are much stricter for children. Why is that?
It's heartbreaking. Children have this incredible physiological reserve. They compensate for blood loss so well, maintaining their blood pressure, until they just fall off a cliff.
A sudden catastrophic collapse.
Exactly. A sudden, profound, and usually irreversible collapse. So by the time a child is in traumatic cardiac arrest, the injury is almost always non-survivable.
So what does the data say about a child who arrives with no signs of life?
The data is, unfortunately, 100% clear. Pediatric patients in that scenario who underwent the procedure had 100% mortality.
0 survivors.
0. The guidelines are very direct.
Yeah.
You should not perform the procedure in that situation. There's no benefit.
Okay, let's shift to the procedure itself. For the patient who qualifies, what's the standard approach for access?
Speed is everything, so the approach is standardized. It's a left anterolateral thoracotomy.
And where is that incision, for anyone listening?
You're going into the 4th or 5th intercostal space. That's the space between the ribs. The incision runs from the edge of the sternum all the way over to the mid-axillary line, under the arm. That gives you the fastest access to the heart and the aorta.
Once you're in, you have seconds. What's the checklist? What has to happen immediately?
There are 4 things you have to do, basically all at once. First, relieve cardiac tamponade. You open the pericardium, the sac around the heart.
Get the blood out.
Get the blood out. Second, control the hemorrhage. Find the bleeding and stop it, with clamps with your fingers, whatever works. Third, start open cardiac massage. 2 hands, right on the heart.
And the last step.
Fourth is aortic cross-clamping. You clamp the descending aorta to redirect what little blood is left up to the brain and the coronary arteries. And then, internal defibrillation if you need it, with much lower energy, maybe 10 to 50 joules.
This whole event is it's incredibly intense. We talk about the patient, but there's a huge toll on the providers, the so-called second victims.
The psychological burden is immense. There was a national study that looked at trauma surgeons specifically.
And what did it find?
It's pretty shocking. 40% of them reported having symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and 15% met the full criteria for a PTSD diagnosis.
15%.
That's a huge number. It just shows the corrosive effect of making these life and death decisions day in and day out.
And beyond the psychological trauma, it's physically dangerous in that room.
It absolutely is. Another study found a 7.2% occupational exposure rate during these procedures.
So about 1 in every 14 procedures, someone on the team gets hurt.
That's right. And we're talking about scalpel cuts, needle sticks, getting cut by a sharp edge of a broken rib. It's a high-speed, high-risk environment for everyone.
So when you put it all together, what's the final message? This is an extreme procedure, but one that is really defined by tight, evidence-based margins.
That's it, exactly. The evidence gives you clarity in the chaos. It pulls the decision away from being a desperate gamble and makes it a highly specific, targeted intervention. It all comes down to the data penetrating versus blunt, the time limit, and that really powerful ultrasound finding.
The data gives us that absolute line in the sand. I think it boils down to this. If a patient doesn't have at least a 1% chance, they probably don't need 100% of our resources applied in futility. The evidence guides the ethics. And for you, I think the thing to consider is this. What does it mean to have a tool with that 100% negative predictive value? How does having technology that can definitively say no change the way you approach these impossible situations? That's something to really think about.